Greetings, fellow humans, and welcome to the Renaissance Yorkshireman podcast. Today, I'd like to talk to you about some specific parts of game theory and Machiavellianism that relate to post-capitalism. So before I get into these aspects of game theory and Machiavellianism, I just want to mention three classic texts on the subject. So the first one is Sun Tzu's Art of War, the second one is Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, and the third one is Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. From Niccolo Machiavelli, we get two words in English, Machiavellian and Machiavellianism. I don't think Niccolo Machiavelli was an evil person per se, despite the fact that the word Machiavellian has become associated with often evildoers or people who are trying to climb the political ladder or gain political power. I think he identified some objective strategies that can be used to gain power. Now, sometimes power can be misused and to oppress people, in which case those things could be construed as evil, but that's not necessarily the case. Power can also be used in a beneficial way by people who are reasonable human beings and not dysfunctional to make the lives better for the population of particular areas. Robert Greene, in his book The 48 Laws of Power, is essentially saying that there are a finite number of strategies that humans can employ to gain power. Given that the human brain is of a finite size, it undoubtedly relates to that. And he's taken the leap and said there are 48 strategies. He may be right, he may be wrong, but it's a very useful book if you want to know about how people seek to get into power and how they seek to maintain power. Before I move on to some of the specific strategies that I want to look at, I just want to give you an example of Machiavellianism, which I think is an example of someone using it for good and someone using it for evil. If you're British, you've almost certainly heard both of Derren Brown and Sir Jimmy Savile. If you're not, I suggest you go and Google them. But I think it's fair to say both of these individuals could be described as Machiavellian. Jimmy Savile, on the one hand, worked for the BBC, was a friend of Prince Charles and was a serial child rapist and child procurer, and he used Machiavellian strategies to maintain his personal power and to get away with some incredibly unpleasant things. Derren Brown, on the other hand, is Machiavellian, but he's using his skills to bring joy and laughter into people's lives. So, although they can both be described as Machiavellian, the ends that they're using the strategies for are completely different. Before I talk about the three strategies that I want to get into, I want to make another point about tools. If you think of a hammer and a screwdriver, they're two completely different tools. If you want to knock a nail into a piece of wood, you're gonna go and get a hammer, because a hammer is far more efficient at knocking a nail into a piece of wood than a screwdriver. On the other hand, if you want to take a door off its hinges, you're going to get a screwdriver rather than a hammer, because a screwdriver is designed to unscrew screws and you can use it to take a door off its hinges. So the first thing we need to recognize is use the appropriate tool for the appropriate job. It's not rocket science. The second point I'd like to make, a hammer can be used to build a house, which is a very positive thing, but a hammer can also be used to bludgeon someone to death, a very negative thing. So the hammer itself is neither good nor evil. It's essentially a completely neutral tool. How exactly you use the tool determines on whether the outcome is going to be a good one or an evil one. So the vast majority of tools are in fact neutral, and it's only the way that we use them that determines if they're going to be good or evil. I'd like to talk about three particular strategies: tit for tat, generous tit for tat, and win, stay, lose, shift. And most of the evidence that I've looked at comes from Anatole Rappaport, who was Professor of Mathematical Psychology, and Robert Axelrod, who was a Professor of Political Science and Public Policy. They ran a competition whereby a number of different strategies were programmed into a computer, were run over 100,000 or more rounds to see which strategies came out the best. But it's worth noting that Professor Axelrod says this: the first question you are tempted to ask is, what is the best strategy? In other words, what strategy will yield a player the highest possible score? This is a good question, but no best strategy exists independently of the strategy being used by the other player. It's worth noting then that the strategy that you choose is always partly dependent on the strategy that the other player is going to choose. So one strategy that might work with one person may not work with another person. So we need to pick strategies partly on context, partly on our own personal biases for which types of strategy we prefer, but partly based on the person that you're playing and what strategies they're likely to choose. As it turns out, according to their research, the 3 strategies that consistently score better than other strategies are tit for tat, generous tit for tat, and win, stay, lose, shift. One point to note about these 3 strategies is they are all very simple. And according to Professor Kevin Dutton, the author of The Wisdom of Psychopaths, which is an excellent book, I thoroughly recommend it, he says, our brains have a preference for simplicity over complexity. So as a general rule, simple strategies will normally outperform complex strategies, partly because there's less chance of misunderstanding between players. In a basic understanding of game theory, there are 2 ways you can play a game. You can reciprocate or you can defect. So reciprocate means you are returning a favour that's been done to you, or you're giving a favour in the first instance. Defect means you are not giving a favour, you're trying to gain at the expense of someone else without giving them something in return. Tit for tat. It starts off like this. We have 2 players, Jane and John. Jane does John a favour. John has 2 choices. He can either reciprocate or he can defect. If he reciprocates, Jane does the same. If he defects, Jane does the same. So she's doing the same that he does to her. So Jane starts off by doing John a favour. He reciprocates, then she reciprocates, then he reciprocates, and she reciprocates. It's a win-win situation. It's a positive feedback loop. But it may be that she does him a favour, then he doesn't do her a favour. Now, because he's not reciprocated the favour and she's chosen tit for tat as a strategy, she then defects as well. So she doesn't do John a second favour. Then the defecting cycle will be negative for both players. So in that case, if they're both reciprocating, it's a very positive game for both players, but if they start defecting, it's a very negative strategy for both players. Generous tit for tat is nearly the same as tit for tat, but instead of always repaying a defection with a defection, it only usually does so. So maybe 3 times out of 4. What this means is that if they get into a negative spiral, so it can break the cycle of negative defections that can occur with tit for tat. Win, stay, lose, shift is also a very simple strategy, but it's essentially neutral. If your strategy works, you keep doing it, and if it doesn't, you change. Let's imagine 2 people, Mike and Mohammed. Mike starts off by reciprocating, and Mohammed can then either reciprocate or defect. If he reciprocates, it's a win for Mike, so he stays reciprocating. If Mohammed defects, then that's a loss for Mike, so he changes his strategy and he starts defecting. The thing about these 3 strategies is they're all simple to understand, and If you're playing with a rational player who is not a psychopath, then they will tend to perform extremely well in the long term, better than other strategies. One of the problems with choosing strategies occurs when you're not playing someone rational or you're playing someone who's a psychopath or a narcissist. According to Professor Simon Baron-Cohen in his book 0 Degrees of Empathy, A New Theory of Human Cruelty, there are 3 types of people who he identifies as having 0 degrees of empathy negative. Those 3 types are psychopaths, narcissists, and people who suffer from borderline personality disorder. These 3 types of people will tend to favour strategies where they gain at the expense of other person. We call these nasty strategies as opposed to tit for tat and generous tit for tat, which are nice strategies. If you're going to employ a nice strategy with someone who normally employs a nasty strategy, you will almost certainly lose out. If you're involved in a game with one of these 3 types of people, you have to be extremely careful about the strategies you choose, because whatever you choose, they're going to try and game you at some point and get some type of benefit without giving you something in return. Of course, if possible, choose not to play with one of these types of players. Your life will be simpler. If we look at a more positive example, if we imagine a non-state that is Dunbar's number or smaller, so all of the individuals know each other, it's extremely easy to employ these nice strategies such as tit for tat, generous tit for tat, or a neutral strategy like win, stay, lose, shift, which is going to involve win-win situations almost all the time. Now, of course, people have off days. They might be ill, they might have a hangover, there could be some emotional problem that they've got temporarily. So these nice strategies are not always going to be successful. However, if you've got a mentally well-balanced population who are not suffering from mental health issues or post-traumatic stress disorder, using nice strategies involves massive win-wins. And this, in many respects, is what social capital is built on. Thank you for giving me your time today. Peace.